Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? I'm actually having a lot of fun making this little video series about dice and dice mechanics, and they were inspired by watching a video of Ron Edwards where he had a chat with Ben from the Questing Beast channel, and so he parsed it up into 4 little videos. And so I already made a video talking about dice and information density, and made a follow-up video talking about where that starts to yield diminishing returns if there's too much information or too much stuff on the spectrum of possible results. And now I want to talk about the little D20. Because I mentioned that a little bit in the videos giving some examples, but I wanted to focus a little bit on this die. And this is kind of inspired by something Ron said, and it happens in something like either the 3rd or the 4th video where they start talking about the OSR a little bit, and Ron says one of the things he likes about the OSR is a lot of the creativity that's in it, and specifically, or part of it being the idea that people are examining different mechanics, and he wasn't as fond of the original mechanic. And I'm assuming he's talking about the D20 mechanic, although he could be talking about something completely different. That's irrelevant, a word I will use in this video more than once, because it got me thinking. And so I want to take a look at what actually happens with this die. This little, all it is a linear random number generator. Nothing more, nothing less. And this video is not meant as an apology for the D20 or in defense of the D20 and why these mechanics are the best in the world and you should use them or why they're great, nor is it meant as an attack on the D20. It's more of an objective look. It's what's actually happening with this die, what's actually happening with us and our psychology as we look at this die. What does this die actually do in terms of the rules? What do the rules say the die does in the first place? How does this die actually impact the fiction? How do we think it impacts the fiction? What's really going on? So I want to challenge your thinking a little bit. And so if you don't mind, let's go down this rabbit hole. One of the most common critiques I will hear about the D20 is that it's too swingy. You can never tell it. It's going from end to end all the time, and I want predictable results. And very often, one of the fixes that's brought up as for the D20 is to use a little die pool, like 2 D10, and this will produce a nice gentle bell curve. And that way it's going to cluster a little bit more towards the middle. It's going to model basic competence a little bit better. And it won't be so swingy, and we won't be hitting those endpoints of 1 and 2 and 19 and 20 as much. So it won't be quite as swingy, right? But is this die swingy in the fiction? Or is the die just simply swingy because it's a linear random number generator? We'll get back to that. Some of the things that I believe are going on when we look at the D20, what's really going on with us and the die, a list. But one of the things I want to make really clear, too, outside the fact this is not a defense of the D20, is you're talking about, I guess systems like what would properly be called D20 in the OGL or OSR games which use this die, but it doesn't really matter. The idea is you're rolling this die, and there's a target number, and you need to roll that target number or greater, and if you succeed, then you've done the thing. It doesn't matter what the thing is. If you roll less than the target number, well, you haven't done the thing. So, one of the things that I believe happens is that we tend to mistake a roll and sort mechanic for a roll and total mechanic. I talked about that in the other videos, but I'll get back to this. The other thing I believe interacts with that is the desire and tendency of human beings to assign differences in narrative meaning or narrative weight to the different numbers on this die when those differences don't actually exist. If you look at the rules, if you look at the text of the game, it doesn't say there's any difference between those numbers at all. But we want them to have different meanings. And this kind of goes a little bit hand in hand with sometimes wanting a different experience in terms of wanting a different kind of outcome spread, where we want things to be clustered in the middle a little bit and not be quite as swingy. And we want the actual fictional outcomes to kind of cluster towards, say, a certain level of competence, where people don't perform way above or way below their level of competence, just as often as they perform at their standard level of competence. But is this die really modeling that at all? We'll get back to that. And I love dice pools, by the way. I like D20, I like dice pools, I like a lot of different resolution mechanics. This video isn't about my bias and preference at all. They all do something a little bit different. And it's not just the pieces of plastic and the curves we can see when we run them on anydice.com. It's what the rules actually say all this means, which is important. One of the other things that happens with this die is the difficulty that we have estimating our chance of success just looking at a target number on a D20. This sounds counterintuitive. That should be pretty easy, right? Okay, fine. Well, we'll get back to that as well, because I don't believe it's as easy as we think it is in the moment. And what can actually compound that is when we start adding modifiers to the die roll rather than looking at the target number and modifying the target number with those modifiers, which is something that most people don't think of doing because very often it's not in the rules, but mathematically it's equivalent to do it that way. And last but not least, the fact that this die has just too many data points on it. There's 20 of them to be exact. Does it really have too many data points? No, but it does if you're actually looking at these numbers. What am I talking about? So first off, this is a roll and sort mechanic. This is not a roll and total mechanic. What do I mean by that? Well, very, very easy. If your target number is 14, you could replace this die that has all these numbers on it, and instead get a D20 and that says blank faces, and we put stars or little smiley faces on 7 of those faces, and we leave 13 of them blank. Mathematically, when we roll this die, it's just the same as having a target number of 14. But either we see a star or a smiley face, take your pick, whatever one makes you happier, or you see the blank face. If you get the little picture on it, you know you succeeded. If you get the blank face, you know you failed. It's no different than rolling this die, except it removes those numbers from our consciousness where our brains really, really want to make those numbers mean something. And I have this experience all the time. I talked about it in my last video, but it bears repeating here. When I play Lamentations of the Flame Princess with my friends or anything else, or BX, and we're using this die, and say our target number once again is like a 14. If we roll like a 14 or 15, you know, it's like, hooray, I succeeded, I did the thing, whatever the thing is. If you roll a 20, everybody gets really excited. Hooray, you roll a 20. It doesn't mean anything. Nothing happens in the fiction. There's nothing in the rules that say the 20 means anything, but it's so cool because you rolled a 20. So we automatically look at that maybe a 19 or 20 and we think this is a great success. We assign some kind of narrative weight to that number, despite the fact that the rules don't say anything about that. And say we roll like a 12 or 13, and it's like, oh, it's a near miss. Where was it a near miss? It's not a near miss in the fiction, not by definition of the rules. It's a near miss because that little piece of plastic hit a 12 instead of hitting a 13. It's a near miss like on that table, what's actually going on, divorced from the fiction. But it's not necessarily a near miss in the fiction unless we decide, unless our real rules of the table are that it is. And you can watch my videos and see this happen. If you really suffer through us playing the game and BSing with each other. But one of us rolls like a 3 or a 4, where they get crestfallen. They say, "Yeah, roll a 4." It doesn't have any more meaning. It's not a worse failure than rolling that 11 or that 12. We've just assigned some kind of narrative weight to it, in the fiction, or maybe just, outside of the fiction, at the table, because that's what human beings want to do. We want to assign meaning to those various numbers. When I say this thing has too many data points, it's quite literally, now we're trying to wrap our head around assigning meaning to 20 different numbers, and what do those actually mean? It could be very, very daunting and unnecessary, and that's not what the mechanics are actually saying is happening. We're also like I said before, we're really lousy estimators of the chance of success when we look at something like a D20 and we find out what our target number is. We're really, really bad at it unless they're really, really easy. What do I mean? Of course we are. It's not that hard. People know how to talk, figure out 5, 10, 15, 20, right? We all saw those videos growing up as kids, maybe if you're as old as I am. Okay, great. But that's not how it's expressed. If your chance of success is 65%, what's the target number on a D20 you need to hit? Takes a second, doesn't it? It's an 8. But that doesn't, spring right up to us. It's something you have to look up or think about for a second. Okay, how many is that? Oh, okay. So we are not as good as we think we are estimating our chance of success. It's a lot easier to look at something like a D6 and say, 4 in 6 chance, that's somewhere around 65, 66, 67%, right? Okay. That's a lot easier than something like the D20. Percentile dice, of course we know what our chance of success or failure is because it's in the name of the target number. It's a little tougher with these bad boys. And like I said before, when we're adding modifiers, subtracting modifiers and whatnot, we're subtracting from our rolls. Now we're looking at that target number. We're trying to figure out what we're doing here with this die. We have no clue sometimes what our chances of success are. We know we're really good or not so good at it. And I hope I hit that 15 with my +2 and the -3 for the terrain, whatever that is. How about try this on for size sometime? Modify the target number by all those the modifiers, because then you can actually look at the number on the die and figure out what you actually need to hit. Anyhow, That's kind of a bit of a digression. But the point being that we're really, really lousy at that. And so sometimes this is not the best die for intuitive understanding of what your chances are. But going back a little bit to this binary pass-fail, I think it's very important looking at this die and then looking at, say, fixes for it, or whatever we're actually doing, our real rules at the table. What's actually happening in the fiction based upon the interaction of this die with the fiction, based upon what the rules actually say. And the rules actually say it's pass or fail. Because of that, it's not swingy. Those numbers are irrelevant on the die. The fact that you're going to hit a 2 as often as you're going to hit a 13 or a 10 or an 11, or you're going to hit 20 just as often as you're going to hit that 10 or 11 or 12, that is irrelevant because it carries no actual weight in the fiction. It's all in your head. And so when we use something like a 2d10 as a fix for a d20 mechanic, and I'm not knocking 2d10 mechanics, they definitely produce a slightly different feel, but unless you change the rules of the game, unless you introduce numerical representations of greater degrees of success or failure, which is often what we're looking for. We're really looking for a different game that has a dice pool system and rules that go with that dice pool system and degrees of success or failure built in. When you use 2d10, what actually happens? Well, yes, outside of the game, on the table, when you're looking at the numbers, you will have a greater frequency of hitting numbers like 10 or 12 and 11 and 9 than you will having, hitting numbers like 20 and 1 and 19 and 2 and all that sort of stuff, right? But in terms of what actually happens, if you haven't changed any of the rules and you're just using chances of success or failure, well, what you've actually done is, if your target number is lower, you've made it easier to hit. And if your target number gets increasingly higher and higher, you've made it harder to hit. So you're worse at hitting the guy in plate mail than you were using a standard D20. But you're a lot better hitting the guy with no armor, or the guy that's lame or whatever, than you used to be. It doesn't, it attempts, on the surface, it might model competence, but if you're not changing the rules of the game, if you're not introducing some kind of understanding, either within the rules itself or the tacit understanding that the different numbers on the die actually mean something different narratively, then it really hasn't changed anything at all. It's just changed your chance of success or failure based upon different target numbers. And at the end of the day, it's just binary. And that tacit understanding that the actual numbers on the die mean something, I think that tends to be where we run into the most problems with D20, where it causes people the most problems, because we desperately want them to mean something. We want them to give us narrative cues. Was that a great success or not? Or was that just a near miss? And we want to assign some kind of meaning, and there's just too many data points. I've talked about it before in the video about diminishing returns. We can handle maybe 3, 4, 5, at the most maybe 7 different degrees of success or failure, or difference of something, or levels of competence, and that's even pushing it at that point. 20, we really can't, but we're desperately trying to. So at the end of the day, that's a different way of looking at the D20, what's actually happening with this die, what's actually happening in the fiction, and sometimes what's actually happening in our heads. So it's not a defense of D20, nor is it a criticism of D20. It's just trying to look at it a little bit more objectively.